Welcome to Peninsula Seniors Out and About. Today we're at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance for one of their celebrity lectures. Let's go see what Cindy has for us today.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Western Museum of Flight. I'm Cindy Maka, the director. Rick Van Arsdale is with us today, and he is the pilot and owner of this beautiful Grumman Widgeon. Rick, where are you in the crowd? Wait at the back, and his wife. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank Dave Simon for bringing two of his beautiful classic automobiles to complement the Widgeon. Although our celebrity lecture guest today spends much of his time in the serene isolation of the island of romance, his illustrious reputation as a journalist, author, and historian has long since spread across the channel and to the mainland. His films and documentaries have entertained and educated the public, and the television audiences as well throughout the Southland, and his encyclopedic knowledge of island history is unparalleled. But just for today, we have him all to ourselves. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome me in introducing Jim Watson.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to Cindy and Paul and Gerald and everybody else who helped out in the beautiful Grumman Widgeon there. Usually when I do talks like this, I ask the question, who here has been to Catalina? However, I suspect today, oh, keep your hands down. Today I better ask the question, who has not been to Catalina? Okay, so we do have a few people, all right. Well, and for those of you that have been out to Catalina, how many people made their first trip to Catalina, say more than 30 years ago, 30, 35 years ago? Okay, quite a few. All right, and how many of you flew out on the Seaplanes? Okay, so quite a few, yeah. Now, you have to go back that far, basically, because the Seaplanes, you know, stopped running out there in about 1981, so... part of the talk today is about why they don't come out anymore. Basically, I'll mostly be covering what I call the golden age of the seaplanes on Catalina, which is like the 50s up through the 70s pretty much. So, as you know, my name is Jim Watson, and I have lived on Catalina for the better part of 20 years or so now. And if you've ever known anybody that lives out at Catalina, we wear a lot of different hats. And I am, first of all, I'm one of the projectionists in the old historic theater out there. I imagine many of you have been to that theater. I'm one of the only projectionists, apparently, that can still show a movie on the old carbon arc projectors out there. So we do have a modern digital projector as well these days, but we still have some of the old original projectors from 1939 installed. I also co-manage a little mom and pop hotel out there called the Buena Vista Hotel, one of the last of the original old-time mom and pop hotels. It was built in 1920, and it's been called the Buena Vista Hotel ever since then. So now, I also, as Cindy mentioned, I also am a writer. I write a weekly column for the Catalina Islander newspaper called Mysterious Island. Catalina's Facts, Folklore, and Fibs. And I cover a lot of aviation topics in it, but I cover a lot of other things too, just historical oddities. Everybody's got some strange Catalina stories, you know, to share, and everything from our many UFO sightings out there to buried treasure stories, and I turned that into a book. The other thing I do out there basically is I have a video production company, of course, and over a period of about 3 years, I put together this documentary called Wings Across the Channel, Catalina Island's Aviation History. Now, it's in two parts, 1912 through 1945, and that part, of course, includes World War II. And part two, that's the one we'll be seeing some clips from today. Part two covers 1946 to the present, basically, even though there's no more seaplanes coming out. You know, we still have aviation out there. But I especially like sort of the seaplane aspect of it, of course, because it's a very unique history. You think about there's not much in the way of seaplanes anymore, but here's this island right next to a very huge metropolitan area for the last 100 years. And the island's really too far to build a bridge to, although people have considered that in the past, as I understand it. There's a good column right there, you know, the people trying to build a bridge out to Catalina. So anyway, the film, Part 2, won a Superior Filmmaking Award from the Las Vegas Film Festival in 2011. And it also was aired as part of a pledge drive. They built a whole pledge drive around it for KCET. Some of you, did anybody watch that on KCET? Okay. I was there. Do you remember? I was wearing the same shirt and everything. This is my talk shirt. So anyway, that was kind of exciting. They showed it about a dozen times or so. So that's the main one that we'll be seeing some clips from here a little bit later. And like I say, that era is more one I want to talk about, except that I think it probably would be a good idea to discuss how we got to this point. Like I say, there's a century of aviation out at Catalina, which is just about all anybody has, really, when you think about it. The very first flight to the island took place on May 10th, 1912. And can anybody tell me, other than the people I've already told today, can anybody tell me who the pilot was that flew that plane? Glenn Martin, right. Glenn Luther Martin. He was 25 years old at the time. And if you know anything about Glenn Martin, he was a very deliberate, studied man. And he was taking his time about it. But on May 9th, 1912, he learned that a rival of his was going to be making the same trip the next day. Well, he couldn't have that. So he had his little pusher biplane that he had built in an abandoned church in Santa Ana. And the only way to make the trip the next day was to turn it into a seaplane. So he, just in the space of 24 hours or whatever, he managed to secure a pontoon or a float from a friend of his. And he affixed that to his plane. And he and a bunch of people got together down at Newport Beach, put it in the water. And so it was one of those yucky marine layer days. Not a good day for flying, but we're talking making history here. So he waited it out for a while, but finally said, you know what, I got to go, because he didn't know what this rival was going to be doing up in Long Beach. The guy was going to fly from Long Beach. So he takes off from Newport Bay, circles around once, dips his wings to everybody, and he disappears up into the clouds. So that's the last people saw of him, at least for a few hours. Am I giving away the ending? And so there he was, flying up above the marine layer. He could not see anything below him. And just imagine one of those old gossamer flimsy planes. He had strapped a chronometer to one leg and a compass to the other leg, and he had an inflated bicycle tube around his neck, just in case, as he put it. So as he's flying across there in his suit and tie, unable to see anything below, he just, by dead reckoning, figured when he was going to be over Catalina. And so he slowly descended into the clouds, not knowing if he was going to plow straight into a mountain or not. But sure enough, he came out right over Avalon Bay. And he landed, this, by the way, I cover all this in part 1 of my book, but that's the last unsolicited plug today. So he landed there in Avalon Bay, and a bunch of well-wishers were there. They whisked him off, and he gave a little talk at the Glenmore Hotel, which is still there, by the way. It's called the Glenmore Plaza Hotel. And a few hours later, he came back. Unfortunately, while he was giving his talk, some helpful islanders moved his plane up on the beach a little higher, because I guess the tide was coming in or something. Well, he punctured the float, and there was no way he could repair it out there. So what he did to fly back is he flew straight over to the Palos Verdes Peninsula, because that was the shortest distance over water. He didn't want to spend too much time over water. If he had to go in, he was going to sink. It also was beneficial in the sense that that was the main shipping lanes, that if he did go down, they had a better chance of being rescued. So he flew over to the Palos Verdes Peninsula and then all the way back down to Newport Beach. Now, that flight is significant for a number of reasons. First of all, it was the first plane flight ever out to Catalina Island. It was also, up to that time, the longest overwater flight in world history. The English Channel had been crossed twice before. Louis Blériot crossed it in 1909, and then American aviator Harriet Quimby crossed in actually only about a month or so before Glenn Martin's flight. But those were shorter distances. This was the longest distance. But perhaps the most important thing about that flight that kind of applies to us here today in seaplane history is it was the first time in world history that an airplane had taken off from water and landed on water again. So literally the seaplane started at Catalina and Newport Beach, I guess. I don't want to take anything away from people from Newport Beach, but and it was kind of by accident, really, when you think about it. He wasn't originally going to be flying as in a seaplane, but he basically kind of invented the seaplane at that point. Okay, so now over the years, like I say, I just want to kind of cover these fairly quickly so we can get up to the post-war years. After that, he was joined, other pilots came along, of course, and we started having some of the very first airlines in the United States. Charlie Chaplin's brother, Sid Chaplin, started his own airline, Sid Chaplin Airways, in 1919. It ran for a couple of years, open cockpit Curtiss Seagulls. And a lot of movie stars used to come over, on those planes. And then we had Western Air Express, Pacific Marine Airways. This was the era of the silent movies, and the Mary Pickford and Cecil B. DeMille, who practically lived out at Catalina, would come out there. Charlie Chaplin, of course, Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson used to rent out the whole top floor of the Glenmore Hotel for an entire summer, and they would just party, her and Charlie Chaplin and all these guys. So it was crazy times. And then, of course, the 1930s come along, and everything kind of takes a dive then. But Catalina wasn't that affected, really, by the Depression. In the first year or two it was. But the 30s are kind of interesting in the sense that the Wrigleys started their own airline. They saw what was going on. Philip K. Wrigley, the son of William Wrigley Jr., was an aviator himself. He'd been in the U.S. Navy. And he got together with Donald Douglas. They were good friends. And one day they sat down in the casino out there at Avalon and designed a plane called the Douglas Dolphin, which was designed specifically for the Catalina run. And it's a beautiful airplane. They only made 58 of them. I believe there's only one left in existence. And so anyway, that was Wilmington Catalina Airline, actually run by the Wrigleys. And that went up to the war, basically. And that was another big event that changed things quite a bit, of course. And at that point, the Wrigleys had only they had 4 planes, 2 Douglas Dolphins and 2 Lockheed Lodestars, which are land-based planes, because they had just started opening up the airport in the sky, or it was called the Catalina Airport back then. I imagine there's lots of you have flown into the airport in the sky for your $100 hamburgers, right? Now, one of the important things right now that really influenced the seaplane history at Catalina is the fact that the island is that airport in the sky. The fact that the island is so rugged that it was really difficult to put an airport anywhere. And as you know, they had to shave off the tops of 2 mountains, basically, to put a runway in there. And the only place they could really find was quite a ways from Avalon. And that fact right there has a lot to do with the development of the seaplane at Catalina, because when they built the airport, they didn't realize that most people didn't want to take part in that drive, a half-an-hour drive. United Airlines flew DC-3 mainliners in there from 1946 to 53, but they eventually had to leave because there just wasn't enough business. And the reason people loved flying back and forth to Catalina, but these little upstart post-war airlines were taking all their business. So another big thing that the war did in terms of aviation was the development of land-based runways around the world dramatically increased after the war because of the war. So that was another thing that kind of, spelled the death knell for, we didn't need the China Clipper after that, for example. And, but here we are with Catalina that, the airport is a half of an hour from town. It took longer to drive to the airport than it did to fly to the island in the first place. So anyway, that brings us to the post-war years. And one other legacy of World War II that affected Catalina, kind of in an offhand sort of way, and there's probably some of you waiting for me to bring up the PBY. And the PBY Catalina really didn't have a whole lot to do with the island per se, other than being named after it. And the story basically is that just before the war, there were some RAF pilots training down in San Diego. And they were flying around in these consolidated PBYs, and they kept asking, what's the name of that bloody island down there? And, well, that's Catalina, and so the name stuck. So we have the British, basically, the RAF, to thank for naming the plane that saved many, many lives in World War II after Catalina, even though it never really had much to do with the island. There were a few airlines. There was an airline called California Maritime Airlines that operated in 1947 for about a year that used PBYs. But they were built for the military, and while they were great at handling the rough seas that you have around Catalina, they required a crew of 5, and they ate up fuel like it was going out of style. So it just didn't really work. So anyway, we come into the post-war years, and all these little upstart airlines, and they were using the workhorse of the Catalina fleet was the Grumman Goose G-21A, sister plane basically of the Widgeon, and later the Mallard. In this first clip coming up, in my film, the film discusses some of the pilots, the crazy pilots, a lot of these guys that had lived through the war and never thought they'd lived through the war, and here they were now working, flying, living in a beautiful tourist place. And so a lot of crazy stories and that kind of thing. Another plane coming up in this segment is this big plane, which some of you may be wondering what it is. This came along in 1957. This is a Sikorsky VS-44, and they only made 3 of these. I've got a lot of footage of this. These clips, by the way, they don't tell the whole story. Some of it might not make a whole lot of sense to you if you don't know the backstory, but I chose these clips mostly because of the great footage, the color footage of the red, white, and blue Grumman Gooses and that kind of thing. So there's a lot of good footage of old Avalon in there. This was one of 3 of these Sikorskys that was ever built, and this model of plane was the very last fixed-wing plane that the Sikorsky Aircraft Corporation built, and these were built in the 1930s. After that, it was just rotary wing from Sikorsky. Our plane right here was literally the last plane, fixed-wing aircraft built. The other 2 VS-44s crashed during the 1940s, whereas this one survived, and there's a whole story behind how Dick Probert, the man who operated this airline, got this plane down in South America, and they almost crashed a couple times. They got arrested by Peruvian police. They almost sank it in Acapulco Harbor. It could be a whole talk in itself, a whole documentary in itself. But for our purposes here, that's just, you need to know that was for 10 years. Many of you might remember this plane. Did anybody fly on this plane that we, all right. We came to call it the Mother Goose, even though it wasn't a Grumman Goose. It was just the term that stuck. So anyway, in this clip coming up, you will be introduced to some of these crazy pilots and the Mother Goose. The gentleman that you're going to see, one of the people being interviewed here, is David Johnston, the twin brother of Phil. Phil, there he is, twin brother of Phil. And the nice little lady is Nancy Probert, who was the wife of the man who ran this airline, Avalon Air Transport, later Catalina Airlines.
The seaplane pilots that Dick Probert used, most of them had role to play as a pilot in World War II, and they brought with them all of that experience and training. Clarence Jasper, who, by the way, was the first pilot I ever flew in an airplane with, Clarence Jasper was an ace for the Royal Canadian Air Force, in Europe in World War II. He flew Hurricanes fighters, and then he flew, most of his hours were in the Mosquito. Fred Pierce and Warren Stoner, two of my personal favorites. Lloyd Burkhart, another classic gentleman with a nickname. His nickname was Jugs. Lloyd Burkhart was trained by the Navy and flew in World War II. He flew materiel and personnel. Bill Kilgore, he was a funny man. We had a nickname for him. We called him Wild Bill. I can remember I was sitting in an airplane at Long Beach waiting for the pilot to get on board. There were a couple of empty seats, and it was a busy day, and they'd had to call Bill in on his day off. And so the personnel at the ramp let him into the plane, closed the cabin door, and Wild Bill came in and sat down in one of the passengers' seats. And after a few seconds, he looked around the airplane and asked all the other passengers, "Doesn't anyone know how to fly this thing?" And everybody looked at him with confusion, and he said, "Okay, well, I'm going to give it a try." So he got up in the left seat and fired it up and flew us to Avalon.
Perhaps as colorful and legendary as the airline's planes and pilots was the gang of ground support personnel collectively known as the Dock Boys, or as Probert referred to them, the Mother Pullers.
As a college student for a summer job, I decided to go to Avalon and get a job. So I went over and interviewed and got the job and started working as a dock boy, throwing the freight luggage and mail and driving the boats around.
The dock boys were responsible for not only loading and unloading cargo from the planes, but for handling the dock lines that tied the planes up and setting them free once again. Because of her size, the Mother Goose required special handling, which involved a complex choreography of chase boats bringing the mooring lines from the dock and then spinning the ship's tail around shoreward. Once in position, she was gently backed up until she could be secured on the bitts. When it was time to go, the lines were dropped and the skipper headed the ship straight out of the harbor for takeoff.
The dock boy job, though, was one of those rare times in my life, and I think probably in everybody's life, where you have a job where it's so interesting that even on your day off, you would go down to see what was going on at the work site, which happened to be in the middle of a glorious bay. The other dock boys, I would say that were the same situation I was in, which was we were generally college students working during vacation, during the summer. And so you can think about college boys in an island romantic setting and the kinds of antics that would perhaps pop up. We would do things to cause trouble with everyone, including one another.
A prank the dock boys tried to pull one time was to pretend that they pushing a large luggage cart into the water fully loaded with freight. But of course they were empty boxes, and Dick caught on pretty quickly that they weren't full. And he was horrified at first, but he caught on pretty quickly.
Then there was the mythical fish by the name of Bruce the Barracuda.
One of the ways that some of the dock boys used to figure out ways to meet girls was to go on the beach and scout out the cutest ones and then tell them that they had a pet, Bruce the Barracuda. That was his name, Bruce the Barracuda, that lived under the docks. And he would come and take food from their hands if they'd put the food into the water for them. So they would have the fish or whatever it was they were going to feed the Bruce the Barracuda, and they'd give this to the girls, and they'd get them down on their knees, and then when they were all concentrating on looking into the water, they would push them in.
When we were kids, Catalina Island was the greatest place in the world to get into mischief. Actually, I grew up on Catalina Island in the summers, and I bet you I spent, I don't know how many hours on the Mother Goose. What a great old plane that was. I used to fly over there with my Penguin, Miles. We're talking about the 50s and the 60s, and it was really a nostalgic period over in Catalina. Those seaplanes used to come in just one after the other, and they had a dock at the end of the pleasure pier, and they had to, they'd land out, supposed to land outside of the harbor, although some of those crazy pilots would stretch it and they'd be landing right next to the boats. But in any case, and then they'd power their way in, and they were the noisiest things you've ever heard. So every 12 minutes, every 15 minutes, one would come in, everybody download, everybody'd load up, and then they'd take off again. And it was exciting to have that kind of atmosphere going on. I know when I was out in my boat, you always had to watch out for the seaplanes, because never know what they're going to do. Yeah, when I was, I guess, anywhere from 12 to 15, they had trampolines over there, these where they were in the ground. There were maybe 10 of them, and you pay 50 cents and you get to bounce for half an hour. Couldn't do that today because everybody'd fly off and there's insurance issues, But I bet you I was on those trampolines at least 2 hours every day. They were great.
Like the rest of America, the dawn of a new decade would bring change to the airline and to Catalina Aviation itself. The Catalina Airport would be open to private pilots for the first time, and the name would be changed to the Catalina Airport in the Sky. Dick Probert would change the name of his airline from Avalon Air Transport to the name he'd wanted all along, Catalina Airlines. And for the first time since Probert's debut in Avalon Bay, competition was in the air. A squadron of new amphibian operators was about to descend on Avalon Bay, beginning with Catalina Channel Airlines, operated by Probert's friend and former student pilot Bob Hanley. To deal with the additional traffic in an already congested Avalon Bay, Hanley's airline set a precedent for future airlines by setting up operations at Pebbly Beach, a half-mile south of Avalon. An improvised ramp was installed, and terminal space and ticket offices were leased from the Santa Catalina Island Company at Pebbly Beach and in downtown Avalon. A specialized role for Catalina Channel was in serving hunters who came in search of the island's wild pig and goats. When the hunt was over, the seaplanes carried the hunters and their game back to the mainland. Hanley's operation was followed in the coming years by Catalina Vegas Airlines, the first Catalina airline to use the Grumman mallard, along with the bright red and white gooses of Catalina Seaplanes Incorporated. But Catalina Airlines was unfazed by the competition. More than a decade after their first flights to the island, Probert's planes were still filling the Avalon skies. And by this time, something else was in the air.
Well, by the time of the middle 60s, we'd been working together a long time, and we just felt we couldn't live without each other. So Dick asked me to marry him. And so in 1965, I actually took a day off and we got married. You got to realize that Dick was older than my dad at this time. He had been married 3 or 4 times.
The May-December marriage would raise a few eyebrows at the time, but the times, they were a-changin'.
The 60s were very tumultuous times in the history of the United States. We had civil rights marches, we had the Vietnam War, we had assassinations, the 2 Kennedy brothers, and Martin Luther King. I myself marched with Martin Luther King a few months before he was assassinated. But the 60s were not good years for tourism to Catalina. It was hard enough to get families together at the dinner table, let alone trying to make any plans for vacations to places like Catalina.
In the later 60s, 67 and 8, I was given a draft deferment because I was providing a service to a community. We had the mail contract from the government, of course, and I didn't have to go to Vietnam because I was working for Catalina Airlines.
There was a period of about 2 years that because of labor unrest, the SS Catalina didn't come out to the island, so virtually all the goods and supplies came on the Mother Goose. The Mother Goose was our lifeline.
In 1967, Dick Probert reached his 60th birthday, and under FAA rules at the time, was required to give up his commercial pilot's license. The decision was made to dissolve the airline and sell the Mother Goose. After more than a decade, Dick and Nancy Probert's empire of content on Catalina Island was coming to an end. Probert continued to work in aviation for the next 8 years, while Nancy pursued her own interests.
Because of my Irish grandmother, I got interested in raising racehorses. And naively, I thought I could get enough money together from the horses to be able to buy Mother Goose back.
In 1975, they bought a 160-acre ranch on the Northern California coast, where they spent their remaining years together flying and raising thoroughbred horses.
And it was perfect because Dick had a little airstrip, he could have his airplanes, and I had room enough to raise the horses.
On May 16th, 2008, Wilton Richard Probert passed away at his ranch at the age of 101. As for the Mother Goose, Probert had sold her to aviator Charles Blair, owner of Antilles Airboats in the Caribbean and husband of actress Maureen O'Hara. In 1969, the plane was declared damaged beyond economic repair after running aground in the Virgin Islands. There, she was beached and sat idle for 6 years. In 1978, Blair was killed in the crash of a Grumman Goose near St. Croix. But before his death, he had donated the plane to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where she sat for yet another 7 years. At the urging of friends and aviation historians, Blair's widow, Maureen O'Hara, finally sprang to action. Throughout the 1990s, with all volunteer help from the original Sikorsky workers who built her, Dick Probert's beloved Mother Goose was restored to pristine operational condition at the New England Air Museum in Windsor Locks, Connecticut, where she now stands on permanent display.
I got to admit, that was one of the funnest parts of filming this, was going, I went all the way back to the New England Air Museum just for that shot there that you saw. And when I first started doing research on the film, I had no idea what had become of the Mother Goose. And I figured, it was long gone. But there I was, I think it was on Wikipedia, and there I saw it. So bought my tickets right away. So anyway. Okay, the roller coaster ride is heading downhill now, because we've already reached kind of the closing years of the seaplane history on the island, and that's what the next clip coming up is about. Basically, the question of why don't the seaplanes come out to Catalina anymore? And as I'll explain here, I actually appear in this part of the film. There's many different reasons for it. The cost of a ticket had pretty much kind of been along the same price as going on the steamer, but you got there a lot quicker. But starting in the 70s, that started to increase from there. And the kind of the main thing was the insidious corrupting agent that I will talk about here in the film coming up. Basically, the march of time and the elements against this vintage equipment, these Grumman Gooses that were mostly built in the 1930s. And a lot of those planes had been through the war, first of all, and we're already talking the 1970s, so that kind of equipment, 40 years old. And Rick, what does salt water do to seaplanes? Yeah. So anyway, after all these decades of seaplanes coming out to Catalina, there was one last hurrah through the 1970s where there were many, many airlines that ran mostly Grumman Gooses and Grumman Mallards out there until finally it was the end of an era. So that would be clip 2. And after this, I think we can take some questions and answers.
Well, it was April or May of 1962. I was 9 years old. I just came home from school, and my Dad told me he was taking me and Mom to Catalina Island on a seaplane. And I asked him, I says, what's a seaplane? And he says, well, that's an airplane that lands and takes off from water. And I said, Dad, airplanes don't take off from the water. They don't land in the water. He says, yeah, honest, they do. And I said, no, Pop, they don't. So we go to Long Beach Airport. We get on the plane. We fly over. Well, sure enough, that day the water was too rough, and we landed at airport in the sky. And we get off the plane, and I turned and looked at my dad, and I said, Dad, I told you, airplanes don't land on the water. And there was nothing he could say.
When I went to work for Air Catalina, one day, Fred Ogston, he had a ramper push him out to the airplane in a wheelchair. And when he got right up to the boarding ramp with people looking out the airplane on the left-hand side, he crawled on all fours out of the wheelchair, up the ramp, through the cabin, crawled into the cockpit, and lifted himself into the pilot's seat and took off and brought.
I was the manager for the Avalon High School basketball team, and we had to go over town for a CIF game. Well, we couldn't take the boats because the water was too rough, so we chartered two Gooses, which was the Catalina Seaplanes, and as soon as we got off the ramp, we just took off, and as soon as we were in the air, the pilot was just taking the yoke and going like this with the yoke and yelling, Yahoo! Yahoo! Like it was a bunking bronc, and it was just the water.
Well, the first time I made the trip to Catalina, the 26 miles across the sea, was an experience I'll never forget. Nor will my wife. Even though the preps had 26 miles by then, it was on the charts and had done very well for us. I had not been to Catalina when I wrote the song, which is a whole other story how I knew about the island. An architect friend of mine asked me if I'd come over, and we said, fine, great. He said, I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to give you the royal treatment. We're going to fly you over on a seaplane. My wife was a little antsy about flying, but I assured her, no problem, these are seaplanes. She said, yeah, but we're flying over the ocean. I said, well, what better than a seaplane to fly over the ocean? Finally convinced her to do it. We get on the plane, I guess it was in Long Beach or San Pedro, and we head out towards the island. Now, ordinarily, as I was told when we got on the plane and started over, halfway across, we will pass the plane that has left Catalina and is heading back to the mainland. Well, we got to the halfway point, and there was no plane going the other way. And as we come in over Avalon Harbor, my wife gives me an elbow in the ribs and points out the window down below us, and there in Avalon Harbor, upside down, floating in the water, is the other seaplane, with scuba divers all around it, their suitcases, luggage floating all over in the water. Fortunately, nobody was seriously hurt. That was my introduction to air travel to the island.
If I have to swim, I'll do it forever till I'm gazing on those island curves. 40 kilometers in a leaky old boat, any old thing that'll stay afloat. When we arrive, we'll all promote.
The thing that's particularly gratifying to me about 26 miles is how it's maintained its popularity throughout the years. And the four preps these days are out touring. I'm in my 56th year. That's 56 years the lead singer of the preps. And we travel all over the world. Maybe we'll be in your neighborhood. Come on by and say hi and sing 26 miles with us.
The 70s and 80s were sort of the last hurrah for the seaplanes on Catalina, and what a hurrah it was. There were more airlines coming out to Catalina during that period than any other period in the island's history, especially after the SS Catalina was taken out of service in 1975 for the last time. In those days, the seaplane was the way that people got to Catalina, whatever your business at the island.
The 70s and 80s saw a confusion of many new airlines come onto the scene, many of which were simply outgrowths of the earlier airlines. Catalina Channel Airlines, for example, became Catalina Seaplanes, then became Air Catalina in 1973. Dick Probert's old airline, Catalina Airlines, was acquired by a man named William Pereira, who changed the name to Golden West Airlines. And when he sold the airline in 1973, the new owner changed the name back to Catalina Airlines. The name Golden West lived on in the form of a subsidiary of Aero Commuter. Catalina Airlines, one of the last seaplane operators out here, started out as well, Catalina Airlines, and was one of the airlines that used the Grumman Mallard. There were many others that came and went during this period, and nearly all of them used a permanent ramp that had been installed out at Pebbly Beach, although there was a brief time that Golden West Airlines was using a special ramp that had been installed at the Cabrillo Mole, just a short walk from Avalon. Across the channel, the major departure points for the island were not only Long Beach, but a new ramp and terminal that had been built under the Vincent Thomas Bridge in San Pedro.
Air Catalina was quite a unique operation. It was incredible. We had 5 aircraft operating out of San Pedro, our main hub, and we'd fly in 1 aircraft every hour into Long Beach Airport. Then in the morning and afternoon, we'd lose another aircraft to the Cat Harbor run. So we had 3 aircraft humping back and forth from San Pedro to Avalon.
When I first came to the island, I started working for Catalina Seaplanes down in Avalon as the station manager. It was an exciting time of Catalina's history because the seaplanes were in the summertime going back and forth as fast as we could get them going, and I'm kind of proud of the fact that I was here and ran the operation when we had an Easter weekend that was probably some of the worst weather we've ever had, and we hauled well over 1,000 people off the island by using the airport in the sky instead of the Pebbly Beach seaplane terminal, with a combination of seaplanes and de Havilland Twin Otters we chartered from Golden West Airlines.
Beginning around July 1 through Labor Day back then, every Friday would begin at the crack of dawn with all the LA Long Beach papers being loaded onto the aircraft and brought over here, leaving San Pedro about 5:30, 5:45 in the morning, followed by the mail. And then after that, all the UPS being shipped over, and we'd have 4 or 5 aircraft full of freight in the first hour and a half of daylight operation.
Why did the seaplanes stop coming to Catalina? It's been well over 20 years since the last successful seaplane service out here, but it's a question we still get asked from time to time. And as it is with many questions, it really has more than one answer. Part of it had to do with the price of a ticket. For decades, it was only a little more money to take the seaplane out here than to take the steamer. It was about $5.50 to fly here as opposed to $5 on the SS Catalina. And you were here in about 15 minutes as opposed to 2.5 hours by steamer. And you got to fly in a seaplane. But starting in the early 80s, the airfare and boat fare began to diverge greatly. And on top of that, we started to get good, fast, reliable boat transportation that cut the cross-channel trip to about an hour. Another factor was that for years leading up to the 1970s and 80s, there had been a sort of insidious, corrupting agent at work behind the scenes with Catalina's seaplanes. And that was the march of time and the elements versus the already vintage equipment that was being used, namely the Grumman Goose and the Grumman Mallard. Starting even in the late 50s and going through the 70s, there were quite a few accidents involving the seaplanes, not all of which made it into the papers. Some were fatal, but many were just enough to take one more goose out of the ever-dwindling fleet of gooses. Virtually no one was building new seaplanes anymore, not the larger commercial types that could be used at places like Catalina anyway. And going hand in hand with that was it was getting harder and harder to find and train new seaplane pilots. Whatever the reasons, it was the end of nearly 70 years of regular seaplane service to the island.
Catalina Island is blessed with such a wonderful aviation history. At the Catalina Island Museum, we have a permanent display on this history, especially about the seaplanes, because so many people fondly remember taking the planes back and forth to the mainland or on their trips to Catalina.
I first started flying in the seaplanes when I was 6 years old, and that started a love affair that continued for the next 25 years. I remember being down at the beach, swimming, enjoying the hot sand, and seeing those planes coming right down the canyon. And these are memories that can never be taken from me, and I think that these were probably the greatest years of my life.
The legacy of Catalina Island's aviation history is still all around us. We now have quick, efficient, scheduled helicopter service to the island, and the airport in the sky is still a busy little place with private pilots coming in and out. Perhaps the most romantic legacy is that most of our parcel service and U.S. mail service is flown to the island on one of the last DC-3s in commercial operation in the United States. For a century, pilots have looked across the channel out at Catalina, silhouetted by the setting sun, and said, "I'm going to fly there." And fly here they did, and in so doing spawned an era that was unique in American history. Certainly the seaplane aspect of that history was unique, and it's an era that will probably never happen again, although I'd love to have someone prove me wrong about that.
This is Big Probert saying goodbye.
All right, well, that pretty much does it, I guess. Nancy Probert took most of that footage that you saw, the color footage, so I want to thank her, although she's not here. She still lives up, if you caught the part about the horse ranch up there, that she's still raising thoroughbred horses, still trying to hit it big, but I don't think the New England Air Museum is going to sell her the mother goose back. So anyway, I guess that's probably about it, and if we have any questions or anything you want to talk about. How did he asked, how did Glenn Martin land again with the punctured float? Good question. He landed as close to shore as he possibly could. And all the people were still waiting for him that had seen him off from that point. And he basically bailed out as fast as he could and asked everybody to run over and help keep the plane out of the water. And he had one famous line, the chronometer that he strapped to his leg that I was telling about. It was a watch, basically, his gold watch. And he yelled to his friend Charlie Day. He said, "Charlie, come get my watch." He was more concerned about his watch getting wet than his plane sinking. Charlie Day, by the way, was the man who went on to develop the laminating process for wooden propellers. So anyway, but good question. At what the price of a ticket, it was generally about $5.50, when we're talking here in about the 1950s, even most of the 60s, I think. The steamer was about $5. So even though 50 cents was worth a lot more back then than it is now, it still wasn't that much of a difference. And so a lot of people opted to take the planes. It was rising costs of fuels and especially, litigation that really started making the price go up. He says that I forgot to mention the famous Buffalo burgers. Didn't I? I talked about $100 hamburgers, but I did not say $100 Buffalo burgers. So they've got good ones up there at the airport, by the way. No, they really didn't. It is interesting to note, however. Oh, he asked PB 5M Mariners, right? Yeah, which was a Martin plane. It's kind of interesting to note, one of the little oddities I ran across in researching my column is that for a short period of time, the island company, the Wrigley's, were planning on getting one of those to use as transportation to the island, but not have it fly to the island. What they were going to do was use it as a ferry boat, basically, and it would never take off. It would just taxi all the way across the channel. That way they didn't have to deal with the FAA or anything like that. But no, that idea didn't last long, and I can see why. So let's see, somebody else here. Okay, he asked about the albatrosses. The albatross, as far as Catalina goes, interestingly enough, was never really used. I think there might have been one airline of those many airlines you saw listed, like back in the 70s, that, for 2 months operated or something, and I believe they had an albatross. I have come across material where they talk about approving an airline that uses the albatross, but they do come out now and then. I know for a fact, because last year for the Catalina Air Show last year, I got to fly in one of those. We took off from Avalon Bay in the albatross that belongs to Row 44, the corporate. It's a corporate plane, and we went up and landed at the airport in the sky. So they've been out there, but it was never really, you'd think it would be something that some airline would have used more, but I think it was kind of like the PBY, that is a little too costly to run as a commercial airplane. Yeah, he asked about regular scheduled service to Catalina Harbor, which is up at the Isthmus, if you're not familiar with that, up at the town of Two Harbors. Yeah, there was a lot of activity up there. As you saw, a lot of hunters would fly in to that area. Fishermen, just people coming out. And it was scheduled service. It wasn't nearly as popular as Avalon, but it was a regular. There was some good footage there of a plane a goose going into the water there at Cat Harbor. And they didn't have really good facilities there, unfortunately, and a lot of planes ended up damaging their landing gear because, they would haul them up, of course.
Was it the ramp at Wells Beach that come out?
Yes, it was. It was the ramp at Wells Beach, which is still there. It's a kind of a corporation yard for the Conservancy. Stores a lot of their trucks and stuff there, yeah. That was when the Bombards were running Two Harbors, so he dealt with them a lot. The Bombards now own Catalina Express, the boats that come out there. It could be, he talked about an incident of a plane, Grumman Goose, landing in the water with the wheels down, because originally it was going to land up at the airport in the sky because of weather. I can't tell you how many stories like that I came across. It's just a tiny fraction that you see in the film here of those kinds of incidents. That happened quite a bit. Sometimes the reverse would happen. We had an airline called Amphibian Air Transport, which is before Dick Probert was there. We're talking the late 40s. And that happened on not their very first flight, but all the principals in the company, the owner, the president, were flying out to Catalina a week before the airline was going to start, and that's what happened to them. They come in to land, and they forgot to bring the landing gear up. That same airline, about a year later, did the reverse, where they took off from the water out here at Catalina, going back to Burbank, forgot to put the gear down. And nobody was injured or seriously injured in either one of those. Oh, the stories, there's more stories like that in the film, but another typical one that I didn't put in the film was a goose that was a little bit light in the nose was taking off from Pebbly Beach. This was, I think, in the mid-60s. This is your documents that I came across in the Island Company. And so the pilot was a little bit light up forward. So the pilot asked his helper to bring 2 or 3 5-gallon cans of gasoline from aft and putting it up in the nose to bring the nose down a little bit so they could take off. They couldn't take off. So his helper did that, and everything was fine, and they took off just fine. Well, about halfway across the channel, everybody started smelling gasoline in the cabin, including the pilot, who was smoking a cigar. He lands the airplane right in the middle of the channel, big swells rolling up and down. He climbs out of the cockpit onto the nose, smoking his cigar, reaches in, grabs the 5-gallon cans of gasoline and dumps them all out, gets back into the pilot's seat and takes off. So those stories are all over the place.
Was that Jug's bird card?
The person and the airline are not named in this, so I don't know. In this, it was a report the island company got. They weren't named. This was a report that the island company got from passengers, and they did not. It was a kind of a secret memo that I read, and they didn't put that in. He asked what the last sailing of the SS Catalina. Now, I imagine a lot of you have been on the SS Catalina. That's a whole other story in itself. Yeah.
I've got the pictures with Catalina flying boats, and they're dated 1988, June of '88.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Catalina Flying Boat still operates.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the Goose.
The Goose, yeah. That was Frank Strobel owned that Goose. That, I'm glad you brought that up, was the last Grumman Goose used in commercial operation at the island, although it wasn't for passenger service. It was for freight. And they, to this day, they're the ones that own that DC-3 that you saw earlier. And they still call them Catalina Flying Boats, but they don't have anymore. And that is our contract agent for the U.S. Mail and UPS, that kind of thing.
So they still have 2 DC-3s?
Not any longer. They finally are down to 1. They had to cannibalize the other one, basically. And yeah. Yeah, they've got 1, I think. Yeah. And that one's, they only use the DC-3 when it really warrants it. This time of the year, it's probably just about every day. So, another question? Okay. Yeah. It's really something. Is it what? Yeah, I mean, they're always working on it. They keep good care of it, and they have a lot of extra spare parts now because of the other one being taken apart. So that's the DC-3 that you saw right at the end here, taken off from airport in the sky. So, all right. Well, anyway, thank you. I'll be here for a little while if anybody wants to throw some money at me and get a book signed or whatever. So, but thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you for watching Peninsula Seniors Out and About here at the Western Museum of Flight in Torrance. I'm Betty Wheaton. I'll see you next time.